He burst through the workroom door and caught Henrik's wrist as the blade scraped wet ink from paper. Suspicion tightened the chronicler's jaw before he had given it words. He smelled turpentine and hot wax and the raw iron of a new wound on leather. Henrik froze with his knife at the map's margin, a pale crescent of scraped parchment running along a field the mapmaker had once traced by memory. Voices rose outside the shutters. A candle guttered, and the chronicler moved the light with a finger until the scraped nicked line showed the bare fiber where ink had been removed. Within those first 5 breaths the problem sat hard in the room. Someone had ordered that ground removed from maps. The chronicler's suspicion pushed him forward. He pressed his palm to the table, steadying the map between him and Henrik. "Why are you erasing it?" he said. The question half carried accusation, half invitation. Henrik's fingers trembled. He kept his eyes down. The workshop smelled of damp vellum and boiled glue. Shelves held measured weights and glass jars of pigment. The chronicler paused only to close the heavy door behind him, then leaned, operating with the mechanical patience he had learned copying registers. He looked at the scraped crescent and found a faint emblem pressed into the paper where the ink had been removed. A sigil, not a cartographic note, but a mark someone had used to identify the place. The chronicler felt the first shift of emotion. Suspicion widened into restrained alarm as he realized the erasure was systematic, not merely a private uncertainty. Henrik closed his mouth and finally spoke in a voice carved from hoarseness. "It has to go," he said. "They come, they pay. I scrape and nothing is left to name." His words were a small, precise confession. The chronicler, who pays, who comes. And Henrik swallowed, fingers flexing at the fainter line where his knife had passed. That opening confrontation set the day. The chronicler would not let the map be altered without a record. He had come to the village to catalogue parochial territories, and instead had found deliberate subtraction. He had trained himself to convert unease into records. Now the workroom smelled of a particular cruelty. The chronicler removed his gloved hand from the map and lowered himself to a stool. He set his brass loop over the sigil. The emblem sat half hidden under scraped fibers. A shallow cross bisected by 3 notches. He copied its line into his leather ledger with small, steady strokes. The act of writing grounded him. It also shifted him from suspicion to an urgent determination to trace that mark. Henrik's eyelashes cut the candlelight as he watched the chronicler. "They mean not to speak," he said. "If I kept it clean, the men would come and not find proof, and they would leave the parish." The last 2 sentences with a thin, dry laugh that had no humor. Marta's name came out between his teeth. He glanced toward the window as if she watched from the lane, and the chronicler lifted his head. Marta was a widow who kept a small cottage at the lane's turn. She had acquired notebooked fragments and an unburned prayer when fire took her husband's holdings. The chronicler felt the second shift of emotion move through him. Wary determination blurred to a sharpened, pragmatic anger at the idea of people being scrubbed by policy. He closed the ledger. "Show me what you have," he said. Now he spoke as if dictating terms to a scribe rather than pleading for mercy. The tone controlled the room. Henrik moved to a chest and withdrew a folded strip of paper, scorched at the edge, held together by brittle glue. He showed the chronicler a name half visible under suit. 3 letters, then a cross loop burned into the margin. The chronicler read the letters aloud and wrote them again, saying each as if the name were a pressure being returned to the world. They left within an hour. The chronicler carried his ledger and a small metal lamp. Henrik walked ahead like a man with a weight on one shoulder. The lane opened into a village of low thatch and stone. Marta's cottage sat with smoke tracing the chimney. Her garden held a single winter rose. Marta met them at the threshold with a blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders, eyes steady as a woman who had refused to be startled for years. "You should not have come," she said, and the chronicler answered, "You should have told me sooner." He spoke without ceremony. Marta's hands were thick with colice. She took the scorched paper, smoothed it with deliberate, careful motions, and held it to the lamp. Her cottage kitchen had a hearth big enough to roast a pig and a table scarred by whittling. On that table the scorched ledger fragments lay like dark teeth. Marta traced a finger over a burned name and then pressed it flat with the palm of her hand. They dug a mound and put a cross on it with no marker. Then the scribe wrote the name once and burned the page, she said. The earth was holy and not to speak of it. It was for the county. Then they left a stone with no mark and told the parish not to go near. The chronicler listened, recording with the quickness of someone who copied testimony for others. He short questions. Where was the mound? Who ordered it? When did they burn the pages? Marta answered in pieces, each piece a concrete detail. The mound lay beyond the western hedge, a shy, sloping rise eaten by wire sedge. The men who burned the pages had come with a priest, with a scribe, and with masks of authority. They had worked at dusk for 3 nights. Each answer moved the story forward. Each answer made the chronicler feel another pivot in his chest. Doubt curdled into alarm as the pattern of erasure emerged more clearly. They found the field before dawn. Henrik walked them by short steps, stopping only to point with the brass of his fingernail. The land smelled of turned soil and late leaf rot. A boundary stone sat half sunk in moss. When Henrik scraped at the lichen, the sigil showed, carved and then partially filled by mortar, 3 notches under a shallow cross. The chronicler ran his gloved thumb along the carving and felt the abrasion of old chisels. He crouched and scraped a corner with a small metal tool until the mark showed plain in the candlelight he had brought. The field beyond the stone had a depression half hidden by tussock. When he brushed the grass aside, he found compacted earth and darkened humus in a small circle the size of a man's grave. Marta placed both palms on her knees and did not speak. They had barely started when the church bell cut the low morning. A cart creaked on the lane, and a man in a black collar, Ambrose the parish priest, stepped out with Joran, the scribe, at his side. Ambrose's coat was trimmed in sober cloth. Joran's satchel bulged with papers. The chronicler turned and said, "Priest Ambrose," but Ambrose did not look surprised to see them. He walked straight to the stone, set his shoe on the edge, and read the sigil under its scuff. He put his hand over the carving as if to press heat into it. "You should put that away, Ambrose." His voice was even. "You should not dig up what is consecrated by distance. Some places are meant to be left unnamed." The chronicler looked at him and felt a new emotion rise up. A cold contained betrayal because the parish priest's calm carried weight. Who ordered the erasure? The chronicler. Ambrose kept his palm on the stone and said, "Order came from the county and from those who held stewardship. We enforced the silence to keep peace." Henrik muttered. "They burned the ledger." Joran watched and wrote. The names would only bring ruin if kept." Joran stepped forward then, and his voice was quick. "We recorded what we had to and then removed it by decree. The scribe's duty is to remember what the Lord commands and not to make more trouble." The chronicler noted the precise terms Joran used and felt the first true surge of anger, the third emotion shift that moved him from alarm to a driving insistence. This was not accidental neglect but a coordinated, enforced deletion. Words bent into action. Ambrose gestured. 3 villagers, pressed faces drawn with allegiance and fear, came from the lane carrying an iron brazier and a coil of damp cloth. Marta reached for the scorched fragment in the chronicler's hand. "No," he said, and his voice was low enough to cut. "Not here." He set his ledger on the ground and flattened it with the heel of his hand. Marta breathed as if she had been holding for days and let the breath out in a thin line. The confrontation escalated quickly. Ambrose's look hardened. "This harms the parish to excite gossip. We remove anything that will inflame the living." He stretched a hand, and the scribe moved to take the scrap from the chronicler. Henrik stepped between them, his shoulders round. "You cannot take what I swore to keep." "Henrik, I swore to erase it. I did it for the men who pay. I swear to you I did it to save us." The chronicler kept his eyes on Ambrose. "Then who paid for the men? Who ordered the stones?" he demanded. Joran's fingers closed around the fragment and then hesitated. A spark of something passed quickly across his face. The chronicler saw it as a micro shift, a throat clearing, a glance to Ambrose. Then Joran lifted the scrap and set it in the brazier. Marta lunged forward and the brazier tipped. Flames licked the edges of the paper. For a breath the world held its own noise. The scrape of metal, the hiss as the paper caught, a villager's muffled cry. The chronicler snatched a glove and plunged at the brazier. He grabbed the burning edge before the whole piece blackened and tore away a scorched corner into his palm. They argued in a quick volley, 3 to 6 exchanges that snapped like wire. "Give it here, Ambrose, let the thing be purified." "No," the chronicler. Those names will vanish if you do, Marta cried. You do not know them. You do not know the children buried there. Then tell us, Ambrose answered. Reveal a name and we will consider mercy. The chronicler, I will not barter memory. I will record it, Joran hissed. You cannot always force truth when the county demands quiet. The voices knotted and then unraveled in short lines. Each name mentioned was pushed and pulled in the air like a small object contested. The brazier flared. Villagers urged the priest on with brief murmurs. The chronicler pushed his ledger between his knees and shaded the salvaged scrap with his palm. He took a pen and copied the charred letters, one by one. He wrote a name in full and then another. Marta bent her head and began to whisper a string of surnames as if to make them heavy and rooted again. Henrik's fingers tapped a slow rhythm on his thigh. Joran watched with his mouth tight. Ambrose's jaw moved, but he did not speak. A sudden movement disturbed the group. One of the villagers, a man who had not spoken until then, stepped forward and touched Marta's shoulder. I saw them put the men out in the field, he said. I was there when they dragged the prisoners. I buried what I could not keep named. His voice broke. He named the cart driver and the time the cart returned. That admission opened a new window, a detail that no one had expected. The chronicler felt the emotion shift again, surprise cleaving to grim clarity. The pattern of erasure now contained faces, schedules, and a logistics that pointed up from local hands into the county's channels. Ambrose stepped back. His face narrowed. You should not have said that, he told the villager. Joran cursed softly. Henrik took 2 quick steps toward the pit and bent to scrape away damp earth with his hands. Marta pulled at his sleeve. Henrik, do not unbury trouble, she said, and her voice trembled with a physical fear. The chronicler caught one of the villagers' names and wrote it into the ledger, then looked at Marta and said, Who else knows? She named a baker and an old miller, 2 men who had kept their mouths shut. Each new name was a small eruption of danger. Each eruption made the urgency sharper. By mid-morning the brazier had cooled, and the charred fragments lay half buried in the dirt. The chronicler had copied what he could salvage into his ledger. His handwriting was careful and clinical. He had also asked questions that pushed at the parish's seam lines. Why a cross on a nameless mound? Why the scribe's complicity? Why the county's insistence on silence? Each question drew a different face into the argument. Marta accused the steward. Henrik accused the masked men who paid him. The villager who had spoken accused the priest's schedule and timing. Ambrose accused public order. None of the accusations was neutral. Each told of a different motive and a different kind of culpability. At noon Ambrose left with Joran and 3 others, but before he left he placed his palm again on the boundary stone and said, Enough. We will handle this in the right offices. You will not make trouble where there is no benefit. The chronicler watched him mount the cart and felt a heavy pressure in his shoulders. Ambrose's exit was an action that altered the chapter's direction. It moved institutional authority away from face to face confrontation and into the grey bureaucracy that shields sanctioned violence. The chronicler felt a quiet resolve replace some of his shock. He would not let institutional silence stand unchallenged. He would carry what he could on paper and return. That afternoon the chronicler set up a small tent at the field edge. He arranged his lamp, his loop, and his ledger and copied each salvaged name until the letters blurred. He worked slowly to make sure each stroke held the right curve. Every time he set a name down, he looked up toward the hollow in the field and imagined the hands that had carried bodies there. He wrote the names with a deliberate slowness that acted like a promise. He recorded Marta's voice exactly as she had said it. He recorded Henrik's admission that he had scraped the map for money. He wrote the villager's account and the baker's name with the same steady hand. Night came and the chronicler sealed the tent flap. He placed the scorched corner of paper inside his leather ledger and buttoned the pocket. He lit a small candle and watched the flame reflect in his brass watch. There was a shift in him again. Exhaustion folded into a cautious hope that the ledger might be enough to beat institutional amnesia. He pinned the sigil's sketch to the inside cover. He planned the next step, to trace the sigil's appearance in county rolls and in stewards' receipts. He would go to towns where lists were kept, to markets where masks had been bought, to the scribes' guild where Joran had trained. The chronicler's mind moved outward along a chain of records. His actions arranged themselves like steps in a methodical pursuit. Before he slept, he re-opened the ledger and read the names aloud, testing the muscles of memory. He heard Marta's whisper and Henrik's dry laugh. He heard the villager name the cart driver and feel the priest's calm answer. The last sound he recorded was the scrape of his own nib across paper. Outside the tent a dog barked and then was still. A farmhouse shutter clacked. In the end, the chapter closed on a concrete motion rather than a thought. Marta crept to the tent, knocked once, handed over 2 small wooden crosses wrapped in cloth, and said, "For the ones you wrote." The chronicler took them without promise and set them beside the ledger. He struck a match and used it to light a single candle. He placed the candle beside the ledger, bent low, and copied the sigil one more time. He then struck the match and set the page with the scorched edge to the flame, watching the flame test what names would survive and which would not. He blew the match out and closed the book. The candle glass left a ring of soot on the page. He had saved a list. He had lost others. He had a direction. The final beat of the day was a knock at the tent flap, deliberate and near, Ambrosie's deputy, perhaps, or a man from the county. The chronicler froze and then moved to the flap, hands steady on the leather. He unfastened the tie and called, "Who is there?" A voice outside answered with one line, "A man who remembers what you found." The chronicler opened the flap and let the man in. The man's coat smelled of damp straw. He carried a single sheet of paper sealed with wax. He set it on the table and slid it toward the chronicler. The sealed sheet bore the county's crest and a single written instruction: attend the steward's house within 3 days. The chronicler looked at the seal and then at the man who had brought it. He felt the last shift in his chest, resolve tightened into a wary readiness. He closed his hand around the ledger and looked once more at the field beyond. Then he stepped out into the cold and walked toward the village road. The ledger held tight under his arm and the names within it lit like small resistances against the erasure. He would follow the seal. He would follow the sigil. He would follow the men who had ordered the scrapes. The field kept the hollow and the stone kept the mark. The ledger kept the names he had been able to save. The chronicler had made a choice that was practical and concrete: to take those names where they could not be burned. He folded his coat about him and set off toward the steward's road with the lamp dimmed, a map point scratched into his memory, and a list of bitter, stubborn names clenched in his hand. He grabbed Henrik's wrist as the spade thudded into damp loam. Suspicion tightened his jaw. The chronicler smelled wet earth and the metallic tang of old blood on the timber beneath the turf. Henrik hissed and dropped the spade, but his other hand kept the shovel braced over the half-buried post. The mayor's steward stepped forward with a lantern and barked, "Who are you to stand here?" The ground around them smelled of ash and cooling coals. The immediate problem was clear. Someone was burying evidence at night, and the chronicler had walked into the act. He had arrived on the field because of a scrape across a map in a cartographer's shed. A week earlier he had burst through a workroom door and found Henrik at the margin of a map, a small blade wet with ink. He had watched the knife lift and the line of ink disappear. That memory moved him now. Suspicion had followed him from the shed to the hedgerow, and it dictated every choice he made. He tightened his grip on Henrik's wrist and stepped so the lantern threw their faces into hard light. "The chronicler," he said, and the name sounded flat in the night. He held the leather-bound ledger at his hip with the other hand, an anchor and a tool. He needed names. He needed the origin of the timber. He needed the reason a post smelling of ash and iron lay half buried beyond the parish. He put the demand bluntly: "Tell me who paid for that post. Tell me whose names go with it." Henrik swallowed. He had a thin, grey face and a left brow scar that split his pale skin. "Sir, please," Henrik began. His voice broke on the last word. The steward, a square man with a brittle chin, stepped between them and shoved his lantern so the light hit Henrik's hands. The steward: "Leave this to the town. This is not your business." His voice had the blunt, practiced cadence of someone used to ordering other men to look away. He kept one palm on the post, as if the touch alone could finish the burial. The chronicler felt the shift from suspicion to irritation in a physical clench across his ribs. He held his ledger tighter. "Henrik," he said, softening only enough to force an answer, "where did that wood come from?" He used Henrik's name to keep the exchange concrete and to steer the conversation toward facts. Henrik's eyes flicked to the hedgerow and back. He forced out from the north lot, bought from a man in the market. Name, I only heard whispers, coins. They not to write it in the rolls. Henrik's fingers trembled. The steward laughed once, a short, dry sound. Coins, yes. You would make a law out of a coin. Mind your own business, chronicler. We keep order. We burn what is not fit for records. End of story. He tightened his hand on the lantern so the flame guttered and splashed patterns on the steward's jaw. His threat sat in the air like a thrown stone. An external voice cut across the hedgerow. "Henrik!" The chronicler turned. Widow Maren rounded the lane with a scrap of scorched paper clutched to her breast. Her hands were blackened at the edges. A thin line of soot ran along her knuckles. She had a broad face and a voice that did not tremble when she spoke a name. "You took my ledger," she said, holding the scrap up so the candlelight rid the charred letters. "You took my eggs and crossed her from the church roll." Her eyes landed on the post. "You buried the marker." Henrik's mouth opened. "Maren," he began. He stepped forward and the chronicler felt the moment tilt. Widow Maren dropped the scrap into his light. The scrap showed a sigil stitched into the margin. The chronicler recognized the woven mark from a Soon cartouch he'd seen earlier under the map's edge. The sigil matched. The appearance of the scrap changed everything. Suspicion shifted to alarm. The chronicler's hands moved. He cupped the paper between fingers to read the suit. Stained letters. "Maren, who burned this?" he asked. Her voice came even hard. "The steward's men. They come at dusk. They say the Lord in the hall orders us to tidy the books. They say names are mistakes. They pay coins for silence." She spat the last word. She had a ledger full of names, neat small script, and the ragged edge showed where someone had burned pages to hide lines. The presence of Widow Maren produced a new external event, an accusation that directly tied the field work to parish rolls. The steward's smile cut. "You listen to a woman and believe her. You make trouble." His posture stiffened. He used the word trouble like a tool to push the chronicler from the field. "Walk away, chronicler. You stand where you do not belong. This is for the safety of the parish." Safety. The chronicler. He named the concern aloud because he needed to measure it. No ledger says safety when names vanish. Which office gave the order? Which hall? His words were a probe. Suspicion slid toward accusation. The steward's mouth thinned. "Henrik broke. They paid me silver. Thomas dug the holes. I sealed the margins with ash. I did not question who told them to act. I only did the job for a coin." His voice lost its shape and then found it. "They me the parish would be safer without certain names. I thought." He stopped and pressed his palms to his face. The steward took 3 steps forward and lowered his voice to menace. "You keep your hands off Henrik. You will find no lord in the hall. You are making a grave mistake. There are people with more to lose than your curious ledger." He had plainly enough to be understood. Exposing this would cost more than reputations. The chronicler felt the threat as cold as a hand on his paper. He let his ledger hang open enough to show he was a recorder, not a provocateur. The ledger's weight steadied him. He had to decide whether to press the matter here or retreat and gather proof. He chose proof. Henrik led them toward an abandoned cartographer's shed half a mile down a dirt lane. The chronicler followed because the man had been caught with a blade on a map margin not long before, and because memory of the earlier scrape, a blade on paper, ink smeared, refused to let him walk away. The shed smelled of turpentine and old rope. The chronicle's breath fogged in the air. Henrik knelt by a rotting desk and fumbled at a sewn cartouch under the map's margin. His fingers found a hidden flange and pulled. The cartouch came away with a thin scrap of parchment, and there, stitched into linen, was the same sigil Widow Maren had shown. Henrik traced it with a finger and his hand shook. "They hide the sigil here, they mark maps this way and then erase the margins," he said. "It shows where a post will go. It marks the ground to be cleared. They follow the mark." Before the chronicler could answer, cart wheels creaked on the lane. The sound was small but precise, a second external event. The grave digger Thomas appeared, coat dusted with earth, shovel slung across his shoulder, and his face carrying the slow resignation of a man paid to bury things for others. He did not stop. He came straight to the trench and bent as if returning to work. Thomas' voice was low. "They paid for the holes. They paid for silence. I dig, I close, I am paid. That is all. He spat into the grass. His hands bore dried clay beneath the nails, but some markers they make me bury afresh. They ask for names. They say it's for the parish register. They give me coins and tell me not to ask. The chronicler watched Thomas and felt an emotion change. Irritation slid into a colder resolve. He counted details. The direction Thomas nodded toward the east field, the way Henrik's jaw trembled, the steward's hand on his lantern. Each small fact made a pattern. He took out his loop and set it against the cartouche. The sigil was worked in a tight, practiced stitch. It belonged to someone with access to maps and charters. Thomas and Widow Marin exchanged a look that carried a name. You know Reuven's mark, Thomas. He draws sigils like that for the manor. Marin spit again. He is paid by the hall. He does not sign his name in public. He signs with stitch and coin. Henrik's shoulders sagged. They mere name was a wound, and to close wounds. I only did as I was told, he kept saying, only like it would shrink his fault. The chronicler felt pity and then a small, sharp anger. He had seen this before. Men who did dirty work for a coin, and who convinced themselves the coin made them innocent. They returned to the shallow trench. Henrik reached for the ledger he had kept hidden beneath his shirt. The chronicler's fingers were already on it. He needed that ledger to cross, check Marin's scrap. The steward lunged. The moment the steward moved, everything accelerated. The steward drove his shoulder into Henrik's chest. A scuffle erupted. The ledger flew from Henrik's hands and landed on the sod between them. The chronicler lunged and the steward's boot slid across his calf. Someone yanked the ledger toward the flames of the steward's lantern. The leather caught for an instant. The pages hissed. A small flare licked the edge of paper. The flare became the chapter's apex. Hands, flame, and the ledger. The steward wrestled with Henrik. Thomas shoved a spade between them. Widow Marin screamed a single raw word. The chronicler felt his breath shorten, and then he acted. He clapped a hand over the little blaze, snuffed it into the grass, and grabbed the ledger. For a beat he thought the pages had been ruined. Then Marin and Thomas pulled a charred page from the ash where the steward had stamped at it. The page was blackened at one edge, but there remained legible ink. A single name stared back Agnes. The presence of a name on the salvaged paper shifted fear into a brittle clarity. Henrik's confession spilled out in short, pressured sentences. They pay me. The man in the market gave me silver. The steward brings orders from a higher office. The names were plague, too many mouths. They wanted the land kept clean, I thought. He stopped and rubbed his temple. He held his palms open like a man asking for dismissal. Widow Marin, Agnes was my sister. They hacked her from the roll. They took the cross from the mound. They ordered a marker gone. I kept the scrap in my apron. I thought I had hidden the proof. I never thought they'd dig it into the field at night. Thomas added with a dry laugh. I thought the parish asked me. Then I saw the coins. I saw the sigil. I thought the church needed tidy work. I did not know we were burying people twice, on paper and on earth. Now I do. There was a beat of silence in which the chronicler counted names and motives and measurements. Who ordered, who paid, who executed. He moved through emotion the way a man clears a table of plates, suspicion, alarm, resolve, a slow gathering of facts. He could not yet make formal accusations, but he could salvage evidence. He folded the charred page into a scrap of oilcloth and tucked it into his coat. He whispered, "We need Clerk Elsbeth. She will cross the parish rolls at dawn. If Agnes is missing from the official register, we have cause to open the next ledger." His voice was low but precise. He handed the charred edge to Henrik. "Henrik, tell me everything you remember about the market man." "Thomas, show me the spots you dug." "Marin, where do you keep the rest of your ledger?" They worked with method. Thomas pointed out 3 other mounds with stones half sunk. He dug at 2 small depressions and produced old wooden pegs, blunt and charred. The chronicler noted the placement in his own hand. Henrik described a man in a patched green coat who never spoke his name, only left coins and a sealed note. Widow Marin produced a battered satchel, and inside a strip of a ledger with 2 names erased, and a faint stitch where the sigil had been sewn. Every 3 to 5 paragraphs the story produced an event. First the surprise at the field, then Marin's arrival, Thomas's appearance, the scuffle and attempted burning, and the salvage of a charred page. The chapter obeyed that rhythm because each external turn forced a fresh decision from the chronicler. He made lists in his head, and then spoke them aloud. They met under the arch of a shuttered chapel as dawn light edged the sky. Clerk Elsbeth arrived with a bundle of town records, her hair pinned tight and her hands steady. He recognized her from the county seat. She wore a plain dark dress and an expression of readiness. Elsbeth took the charred page and compared the loop of the letters to the rolls. Agnes Halderson, she read, removed. No official reason recorded. This line has been crossed out. The scribe's hand does not match the parish clerk's usual script. She looked up at the chronicler. This is not just a local tidy job. Names were erased in the clerk's book itself. He watched Elsbeth's fingers. She tapped the letters. She did not speak sentiment. She measured ink and asked for receipts. That practical method changed his own emotion. The earlier alarm settled into a working resolve. He felt a strict energy organize his muscles. He assigned tasks. Henrik, show me the map where you scraped the margin. Maren, take me to your house and show me all your ledgers. Thomas, come with me to the eastern line. Elsbeth, cross the rolls for the past 5 years. We will meet here at dusk. We will compare marks. They set a plan, and each secondary character made a decision that affected the direction of the investigation. Henrik agreed to risk going to the shed at daylight to fetch the remainder of the ledger. Thomas agreed to mark the other mounds with a loose stone so that they could return. Widow Maren sealed her scrap in oilcloth and asked the chronicler to watch her cottage while she fetched more pages. Clerk Elsbeth agreed to stay and work through the morning. These choices shifted responsibility from the chronicler alone to a small group. Their hands and decisions formed the next phase of the story. In the hours that followed, they worked through lists and records. Elsbeth found discrepancies. Names erased in the clerk's hand, margins trimmed, paper scorched in places where records should be intact. Henrik returned with a water-stained ledger that smelled of tar and soot. Thomas led them along the ridge to 3 shallow mounds with blunted stakes. Each stake had a notch. The chronicler counted notches and matched them to the sigil. The pattern showed a circuit. Certain rural markers had been cleared on a schedule. A twist arrived when Henrik produced a letter he had kept hidden in his boot. A small note with a seal of a man named Reuven. Henrik read it aloud in short lines. Do what is necessary. The hall must remain pure. Pay as agreed. Reuven, Elsbeth, he is a draftsman who works for the manor. He signs no name in public, but his stitch shows. If Reuven is involved, the manor and the parish register intersect. The revelation reframed the scale of the erasure from men with coins to a coordinated effort tied to a larger authority. The chronicler felt an emotion shift again, from resolve to a wary understanding of scope. He realized the danger was deeper. He, who from the manor would order such erasures. The steward's earlier threat returned in his mind as evidence that powerful men had interest in the operation. He counted choices before speaking. We will not name names in the town yet. We will gather proof. Elsbeth will cross the rolls thoroughly. Thomas will show every stake. Maren will collect all her ledgers. Henrik will lead me to Reuven. At midday they dispersed with tasks. Each hour brought a fresh event. Maren returned with 2 bound folios missing pages. Thomas pointed to a new pebble marking an unrecorded mound. Henrik returned with a map bare where margin lines once ran. The chronicler spent the noon light copying the charred letters into his ledger, tracing the loops with his loop. He recorded the placement of the mounds in coordinates from the old cartographer's notes. The work demanded that he be precise and that he keep his emotions in the check of method. When dusk came, they met again under the chapel arch as planned. Elsbeth brought a stack of photocopied clerical entries. She laid them out like evidence on a table. Here, she said, pointing, Agnes' baptism is recorded. The family paid tithes. The line disappears the day after a new note appears in the steward's hand. The ink is different, the seal different. This is the same day stones appeared at the field. Her voice was steady. The connection was concrete. They compared the marks and the ledger pages. September turned to October in the thin light. They argued in short lines. They pay to erase Maren, they pay to bury the names. They use Reuven's mark, Thomas, they use the steward to order men. They tell me to walk away, the steward muttered, who had lingered at the edge. You do not understand the consequences of exposing this for the parish. The argument grew. There were 3 to 6 rapid back and forths where voices rose and fell and accusations were thrown like pebbles. The chronicler kept to measured questions. He made choices about which document to present to whom. He Elsbeth to photograph the pages and to copy the steward's note for later comparison. Each exchange revealed new facts and moved the plot like a man sliding stones down a slope. Near midnight, the steward tried one last time to end the meeting. He reached into his coat and produced a sealed note. "You are meddling with orders from the hall," he said. "You will have trouble if you continue. You will hurt people you claim to protect." He spoke not as an individual, but as the mouth of those above him. He handed the chronicler the note with an even hand. The chronicler felt the paper's weight and read the seal. The chronicler's choice was to open it or to keep it sealed as evidence. He slit it with his loop and read 3 short lines. A directive to tidy certain parish entries, to remove markers, and a command to ensure no public inquiry. The signature was a scrawl and a stamped crest. The presence of the sealed note was the chapter's final pivot. Proof of orders from above, and the decision to follow that proof into daylight. They ended the night with a plan to move outward. The chronicler closed his ledger and slid the charred page into a hidden compartment. He stacked the photocopies and handed them to Elsbeth. He Henrik to meet Thomas at first light with tools. He Maren to keep her ledger and to show no one where it was kept. Each person made a choice that would shape the next day. As they parted under the chapel arch, the chronicler felt the threads line up. Names removed from rolls, a stitched sigil matching marks on maps, payments passed in market corners, and orders sealed by a crest. The chapter resolved the immediate conflict, a ledger almost burned, a name salvaged, a confession pulled from a man who had been paid to bury papers. But it left the larger conspiracy intact. He walked away with the charred page sewn into oilcloth and a new plan. He had moved from suspicion to alarm, from alarm to focused action, and from action to a cautious hope that the truth could be reconstructed. The final sound before they dispersed was not a reflective sentence but a command. Elsbeth closed the bundle and said, "I will cross the registers tonight and meet you at dawn." Henrik lifted his head and said, "I will lead you to Reuven tomorrow." Thomas tightened his grip on his spade and muttered, "I will mark the other mounds." Widow Maren folded her hands over the remainder of her ledger and said, "I will not let them take my sister twice. The last image of the chapter is concrete and immediate." The chronicler slid the charred page into his leather satchel, felt the pocket watch heavy against his palm, and stepped onto the lane as a cart creaked in the distance and someone called a name from the village square. The call carried a new danger and a new rote. That sound changed the night's closure into the next day's work. He dragged the burlap free and smoke rode up in a hot hiss. Charred paper clung to bone and ash, and the chronicler's suspicion flared into a hard, workmanlike anger. The first sentence of the night was a discovery. A half-burned ledger, pages fused at the margin, blackened names peeking from curling edges. He smelled singed linen and the sharp iron of old blood. He had expected scorched scraps. He had not expected a bound book or the neat, ruled columns that meant someone had taken time to record names before they burned them. That fact sharpened his aim. This was not the random destruction of wind or accident. This was erasure ordered and executed. Suspicion shaped his hands. He crouched, fingers steady despite the heat, and eased a corner of page free with his pocket knife. The paper tore along the burn and a name split into legible letters. He counted breaths. The action that night was direct and urgent. He had come to the pit to look for marginalia and instead found central bookkeeping. That change tightened his jaw and moved him instantly from observer to pursuer. He folded the scorched corner into his glove and stood. Within 2 minutes, a figure shuffled from the hedgerow, sack heavy on one shoulder, cloth streaked with ash. He had seen the man before in the fields. A gravedigger named Jorah. Jorah's gait went crooked with guilt. He thrust the sack away as if to hide it, but the chronicler had already seen the charred paper glimpsing at the sack's mouth. The chronicler stepped forward. He had a ledger. Jorah dropped the sack and sucked a breath. Jorah, the chronicler. His voice was the exact tone he used for testimony. Flat, patient, a line meant to make a subject speak. "What are you carrying?" Jorah's hands trembled. He spat a lump of ash from his mouth and answered in short bursts. "Ash. Papers. Mayor's orders." His words came like a rock slid into a well. Sound and then a hollow. The chronicler did not accept the half answer. He a second, sharper question, fingers already moving toward the sack's top. Jorah grabbed his wrist. "No! Not here. Not now." His grip was raw with fear. He the name of a steward in a rush that left no room for denial. Steward. He burned them. He bury the bones. The chronicler did not need the rest. He had handled ledger marginalia before, had watched a cartographer's blade scrape wet ink from a map, had caught Henrik in a theft of notation. He remembered the scraping blade and the spade thudding into the ground. He remembered Henrik's face when caught. Those earlier facts were not memory poetry. They were blunt reference points. Henrik's hands had done small erasures. Now the erasure came with orders and ash. Jorah sagged. He looked at the pit as if the embers might answer him. "I thought it was for the good," he said. "They names would bring men to the gallows. They the records tied to families. They, who?" The chronicler cut in. "The steward, the mayor's steward. He came with ink and a mark. He paid Henrik the last 2 months' wages for silence." Jorah's voice narrowed. The chronicler felt anger wash through his hands, quick and hot, but he kept the motion minimal. He moved toward the sack and forced it open. Blacked fragments tumbled out. Bits of ruled paper, a singed sigil on a slip, repeated 3 times in a hand he could almost recognize. The sight produced a second shift in the chronicler's feeling. Anger gave way to a cold, methodical doubt. The sigil matched a mark he'd found in his own ledgers, a marginal curl he'd assumed was a clerk's quirk. He lifted the match with a gloved thumb. The sigil's ink had blood, but the curve was identical. If the mark in his books matched the steward's mark, the implication was blunt and obscene. Either the steward had paid men to erase county memory, or the chronicler's own records had been touched by the same hand. He checked the hole in his memory where complacency had lived. He reached for facts. Henrik had been the cartographer's apprentice who scraped ink in the workroom when the chronicler had burst the door before. The chronicler had taken Henrik's wrist then. He had felt the blade bite paper. Henrik's spade had thudded into moist loam in the field when they'd caught him burying something at the margin. Those earlier arrests were concrete events. Now the steward's name joined that sequence. This was not random. This was organized. Jorah's face slackened into pleading. "Please, sir. I do what I'm told. The steward says it's for peace. The steward says no more trouble." The men with him, names, the chronicler. Jorah made a noise and shoved forward a singed paper with a half-burned list. The top line showed a place name. Below it a tall column of marks. A torn corner held 2 letters in N. The chronicler's throat moved, but he did not speak. He read. The list matched the marginalia he'd swept from the cartographer's workroom, and the place names matched the unmarked grounds he'd followed after Henrik's spade had struck timber. The evidence stacked itself in his hands like stones. They left the pit with the sack between them. Jorah moved as if every footfall might set authorities after him. The chronicler kept his face steady, counting the steps, and letting suspicion morph again, this time into a tight determination. He would not let the ledger go up in smoke. He had a brass watch in his pocket, and a ledger in his satchel. He kept both like instruments of interrogation and proof. Under the lane's dying lantern, Jorah fumbled a half-singed slip free of his sleeve and pressed it into the chronicler's palm. The slip bore the sigil and a single line. Mayor's steward, burn after record. The handwriting matched the thicker script on the larger ledger. That second concrete connection swung the situation outward. This was no longer only about hidden grounds. It was now about an official who ordered systematic erasure. The chronicler acted with a plan formed from suspicion and a ledger's logic. He would go to the steward's manor cellar that night. He would not knock. He would not call. He walked the lane like a man carrying evidence to a furnace, knowing the furnace might already be lit. The walk took them past the shallow ditch where Henrik had dropped his spade in an earlier confrontation. The chronicler glanced down, found dark soil and a scrape of wood in the turf. Nothing. He used the scrape to remind himself that a concrete trail existed and that he must follow it. They reached the manor with the chronicler leading and Jorah close behind, nervous taut. The house reeked of old wine and varnish. It had a cellar door with a heavy iron ring. The chronicler slipped the ring up. It protested with a slow groan. He looked at Jorah and Henrik's name came to mind again, not just as an accomplice, but as a cooperator under pressure. He remembered catching Henrik with the blade at a map's margin. He remembered the spade thudding into loam. Those earlier events were a record, and that record forced a different kind of question. Who had paid Henrik, and why had he obeyed? They forced the door and descended. The cellar smelled of sour barley and smoke. A lantern hung low, light cutting across stacks of ledgers, and a table strewn with maps. Near the maps, Henrik stood bunched over a pile of papers, his face pale and breath quick. The steward stood opposite him, hand on a ledger and voice low but hard. The chronicler's arrival stopped both men mid-argument. Henrik, the chronicler, stepping forward, hands where I can see them. Henrik jerked and lifted his palms. His shirt sleeve was singed at the cuff. The steward's eyes hardened. He used the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. You have no right here. The steward, you have no right to burn records, the chronicler answered. Henrik's mouth worked. I tried to save some. I kept margins, I hid names, but I couldn't keep the big book. He paid enough. He threatened my sister. I had no choice. His sentences came clipped, each a shard of a confession. You could have come to me, the chronicler. You could have left a note. Henrik's eyes flicked to the steward. If I tried, he stopped. He pushed a scorched corner toward the chronicler. See the names. The steward moved before the chronicler could speak. He snatched a pile of loose papers and jammed them into the hearth. Flames licked immediately. The table rocked as Henrik lunged to pull the papers free. Jorah tried to block the steward. Hands shoved and grabbed, wood clattered, and a candle tipped, splashing wax across the table. The cellar stank of burning glue. There followed a rapid exchange of shouted lines, 3 to 6 fast spurts of disputes. Let go! Stop that. You burn them and we all burn. You're a traitor. The voices were short and raw, names used to pin responsibility. The chronicler barked orders, not questions. He had to be the instrument that made them act. He grabbed Henrik's wrist and wedged a scorched page from the hearth before the steward could snatch it. The page yielded a smudged list. He read aloud, each syllable measured and neutral. Tollbridge, West Hollow, the Hollow Copse. Marlow Field, each place name matched previously seen margins. Anger flared into something harder. The chronicler slammed the ledger away from the steward and seized it. The steward lunged for the table, knocking a candle. Sparks sent hot pricks of light across the room. Henrik twisted, and for a moment their bodies were a tangle. The steward's hand found a brand, and he struck at the pile again, trying to drag the book's center toward flame. A sound like a board breaking punctured the air when Jorah shoved a chair into the man's path. There was a sudden, small cliffhanger. The steward raised a hand, and for a second everyone in the cellar understood he might reach for the ledger and set it wholly alight. The chronicler moved in a single, decisive motion and took the ledger from the steward's reach. He did not whisper. He tore pages with blunt, fast strokes, ripping scorched edges free and angling them toward the lantern light. The room filled with smoke and coughing. Henrik staggered, clutching at a wound along his forearm where he had been cut earlier that evening. Jorah sank to the floor, chest heaving. The steward crouched and cursed, eyes wild with the calculation of a man who had relied on other people's fear to keep his secret. The chronicler held the torn pages and read names aloud in fragments, naming them into being. Marlow, Anders, Lissa Kettle, each name landed like a slap. It made the steward's jaw tighten. The emotional arc in the cellar moved quickly. Suspicion, anger, doubt, then a grim resolve. Suspicion had pushed them here. Anger and doubt had fueled the scramble. Resolve now took the chronicler's form as he gathered whatever legible pages remained. He did not celebrate. He recorded, with blunt notations, each place, each name, spelling out what the steward had tried to erase. That methodical act was his way of holding people to account. Henrik's voice was small when he spoke. They'd cut my sister's work. They'd take a cottage. The steward used fear. He tested each word as if it might save him. The steward answered with a thin, rapid line. I protected the town. Names bring vendettas. I removed dangers. His words were shortened for a policy. The chronicler listened, letting the steward make his case aloud so the record would hold it. The twist tightened then. Among the torn pages, the chronicler found an entry that matched a ledger he kept hidden under his own coat. A marginal notation there had the same sigil, the same small, crooked flourish he'd once assumed was a clerk's habit. Now it looked like a seal. He realized that the handbook of Erasure had been referenced across multiple offices. His own records had not been merely adjacent to the crime. They intersected with it. Doubt washed over him, sharp and personal. Had his ledger been used to coordinate unmarked burials? Had his name, by virtue of proximity, been used to sanction silence? He felt the second major emotion shift, from resolve to an inward, actioned suspicion that demanded proof rather than accusation. He steadied his hands and did something concrete. He produced his brass loop, set it over ink, and examined handwriting, stroke by stroke. He compared curves, the tilt of the cross on a letter, the way a loop closed. Henrik leaned in, Jorah watched. The steward bragged and grew small. The chronicler called attention to a detail. The steward's thicker pen strokes matched the heavy indentations in the ledger entries. The match was physical, not poetic. The steward's face went pale with the knowledge that paper could betray him. Someone had to decide what to do with that knowledge. The chronicler made the choice with the only tools he trusted: ink, paper, and witnesses. He forced the steward's hand to sign a written confession on a clean sheet. Under the lantern's weak light, the steady strokes of a pen changing his public shape. Jorah held the lantern steady. Henrik signed only when the chronicler ordered him to, hands shaking. The steward tried to bargain. "If you put my name to that, you will unsettle the town," he said. "If you keep burning names, you unmake the town." The chronicler replied. The steward caved with a throat sound and a tight nod. He put ink to paper. He wrote the heavy, legal phrase that carried weight in courts and in gossip. He wrote the command he had given the gravediggers. The chronicler watched the pen tremble and then stop. He filed the signed sheet under his coat with an economy of motion that made no speech. He had the steward's hand in ink. That was proof beyond argument. At dawn, as embers cooled, Jorah slumped against the manor wall and vomited ash. Henrik sat on the steps and pressed a cloth to his forearm. The chronicler carved the remaining legible pages into his satchel, each careful movement a refusal to let smoke win. He had preserved lists and confessions. He had forced a signature. He had exposed the steward. Yet a final twist lay near at hand. Some names were gone, letters melted away into black. Whole entries had been destroyed in the center of pages. The ledger had been partially saved by force, but some people would remain unnameable. The aftereffect left them with concrete tasks, not speeches. They would deliver the signatures to the magistrates. They would place the remaining pages where clerks could copy them. They would mark the unmarked grounds on a new, secret map. Those were actions, not slogans. The chronicler closed his satchel, its leather dusted with ash, and tied the strap. He had a brass watch that he wound and set the chain against his palm. He tasted smoke and iron, and the grit of the cellar floor beneath his nails. Before they left, Henrik rose and approached the chronicler. "If they ask who found it," he said, voice small and steady, "say you did. Say you carried it out of the fire." He meant the line as both shield and accusation. The chronicler looked at him, at the raw sleeve, at the man who had scraped ink and thrown his spade at the earth. He answered with an action rather than words. He slipped the ripped pages into his satchel, closed it, and handed Henrik a small, unburned margin he had pried free. "Keep this," he said. "Hide it. If they take you, you show it." Henrik pressed the margin to his chest and nodded. They left the manor in a stitched, purposeful group. The steward walked ahead with a paper collar around his neck and a face like a man chilled by winter. Jorah moved beside him, smaller now but steadier. The chronicler's motion was measured. He had begun the night chasing suspicion and ended with documents, signatures, and visible damage. The ledger had been torn, but the record now had witnesses. Outside, as pre-dawn light lifted the hedgerows, the chronicler paused and opened his satchel. He set the surviving pages on a flat stone and smoothed them, fingers careful. He ran his thumb over the names as if to count them. He did not say he believed in justice. He did not promise revenge. He acted. He folded the pages and placed them in a waterproof envelope. He pushed the envelope into his satchel and set the strap so it would not slide. That motion sealed a decision. Someone in a town later would have to look at ink and decide whether to act. For now, the chronicler carried the evidence forward. The final line of the chapter is not a vow or a reflection. It is a movement. He locked the satchel, stepped over the ditch where Henrik's spade had fallen, and walked toward the magistrate's house with the scorched ledger pressing at his side. The problem remained concrete. Names either survive or vanish, and this night he had forced several to survive by the only method that mattered: paper, ink, and witness. He tore the ledger from Henrik's hands, and the burlap straps snapped against the chronicler's wrist as mud fell away from a half-buried post. Suspicion had tightened his jaw since the cartographer's room. He felt it again as a cold, deliberate pressure behind his teeth. Dirt dusted the ledger's edges. Pages clung together with ash. He smelled wet loam, tar, and old smoke at once and read a charred letter through the glare of a candle. The problem stood plain within 5 breaths. Names had been removed, records erased, and a town's punishments scrubbed from paper and memory. The chronicler understood what a ledger meant in a place like this: accountability, a chain of orders, a list of burials. He had come to the field to test a hypothesis, not to precipitate violence. The hypothesis now sat in his hand, half-blackened, its pages sticky and warm, and he moved as if the book itself demanded an answer. He held the ledger so townsfolk could see the edge where ink had been shaved away. Henrik scrabbled at the turf with both hands and tried to pull the book back. "Give it here," the chronicler. His voice did not rise, but he said the name slowly. "Henrik," the man flinched. Henrik's reply was immediate, short. "It burns, sir. It burns when you touch it." "Leave it." He pushed his palms against the ledger, and the burlap stung his fingers. The chronicler noticed how Henrik's knuckles were raw from rope, and how his coat carried a smear of charcoal over the left elbow. Those facts shifted something inside the chronicler, first suspicion, then a flash of anger measured into discipline. He would not let the ledger go. A cart rumbled up the muddy track, and a lean figure with a hooked nose and a steward's sash stepped into the open. Heavy-booted men fanned behind him. The steward's arrival changed the problem from private theft to public accusation. Someone else wanted the ledger unseen. The chronicler set the book on a clod of turf and opened it where the burn marks curled like crusted skin. He read aloud, voice plain, not pleading: Elias Mard executed, July the 12th, sentence commuted to burning, name expunged. Each syllable landed on the crowd like a thrown stone. A man in the back, a laborer who had dug at this field years before, stepped forward and tapped the page with a gloved finger. "Elias." The laborer said, "Elias Mard was my brother's friend. They he ran off. The gallows were for strangers." The chronicler let the moment hang a beat too long to be polite. He wanted faces to register the ledger's meaning. The steward pointed. "You have no warrant, chronicler. You tear up our peace. Give that book to me." His tone cut the air. His 2 men tightened their grips on halberds. The chronicler watched the steward's hand, the small, careful movements around his waist where a knife lay concealed. He had seen concealments like that before in the cartographer's workroom, but now it meant immediate danger. "This is evidence." The chronicler: "Names are missing. Orders were given. Someone paid to hide them." He kept his words clipped and factual. He believed that facts could win a crowd. Suspicion moved to proof as he turned the page with a gloved finger and exposed a faint, smudged name set beside a small landmark that every farmer in the valley knew. The ruined cider press on Hollow Lane. A woman near the front, old, knuckled hands like folded parchment, staggered forward and her voice split the dusk. "My son was taken by the Hollow Men," she said. He was a vagrant. They dug him there. They brought no priest." Her accusation landed on the steward like a thrown stone. The steward's jaw tightened, and he spat a line intended to shame the chronicler rather than respond. "We keep our peace, woman. We do what's necessary for order." The woman named the mayor, and the name changed the current in the field. Conversations that had been low grew sharp. Henrik slumped, then braced, and the mayor's steward moved closer, the men-at-arms forming a loose ring. The chronicler felt an inward shift from suspicion to a steady, icy resolve. He had expected resistance. He had not expected the mayor to be named aloud by someone with nothing to gain. "Mayor." The chronicler, voice neutral. He did not look at the mayor. He scanned faces instead to see who would answer. The rhythm of the place had changed. The ledger made silence into accusation. Footsteps clattered on the track. A priest in a plain black coat arrived, flanked by the mayor. The mayor's coat held a crease where a sealed pouch lay hidden, and a faint thread of dried mud cut across his sleeve. He did not sit his weight on the ground. He kept his hands empty and his eyes tight. "You will hand over that ledger, the mayor. You will stop these rumors. We have had enough trouble with strangers." His voice tried for calm, then lost it into demand. Henrik laughed, brittle. "You ordered the erasures, didn't you?" He spat the accusation without preface. You us to burn the pages. You the town would sleep better if the records vanished. The steward's face reddened. The mayor's neck pulsed with color and dryness. The old woman's fingers dug into the soil as if she were holding on to the world. Voices rose. The chronicler stepped between Henrik and the mayor with the ledger on his palm. He had a set of choices. He had trained himself to favor testimony over theater. He had trained to let documents speak before men did. The ledger, he decided, would speak. He read another entry, eyes on the page more than the faces. Margot, daughter of Jory Till, executed, no burial recorded. Name scratched from the margin. When he said the name, the old woman swore and put her hand to her mouth. Others muttered at the sound. The mayor's jaw tightened. The steward's hand twitched toward his belt. The mayor did not shout at first. He offered the chronicler a sealed paper and a bargain. We will seal the ledger and place it in the church chest, he said, provided you promise not to publish what is inside. We will bury the ground again, mark it with a single cross, and the town will forget these men and women as if they were thieves who robbed and disappeared. It is mercy, Mr. Chronicler. Mercy for the living, his voice tried to convince and to bargain at once. The chronicler watched the mayor's fingers close around the seal. The offer pivoted the scene, truth for quiet. Henrik tried to take the book again. You can't hide them, sir. They were names. He moved with the urgency of someone who had been told to shield others for years. His hands were quick, and he lunged. The steward drew a knife and the two men collided with a grunt that cut the air. Sparks of flame licked at a bale of straw knocked from a laborer's cart, and a handful of scorched paper fluttered like black leaves. For a moment everyone watched the ledger tumble into a small fire made by the knocked straw. The chronicler's first motion was reflex. He plunged a hand into the heat and pulled the ledger free, soot smearing his gloves and ember smudging his sleeve. Pain licked his fingers. He did not name it. Instead he said, "Names remain." He slapped the open page flat so the crowd could see the scorch marks and the faint letters. Words fell rapid now. The steward cursed, "Seize him," he called. Men stepped forward. The old woman screamed a name, "Marga!" and then hurled herself at the steward. For 3 breaths the field became a tangle. Henrik tossed a shoulder at the steward. The steward swung his blade. A townsman grabbed the steward's wrist from the other side, and the ledger skimmed the ground. The chronicler crouched and seized the book while a dozen hands reached for him. He thrust it under his coat and rose with it close to his chest. He felt the crowd press, and the mayor's voice try to be heard above the growl. "Stop them, men. Stop them before they make a riot. If this ledger leaves the village, your houses will be fined, your market taken." He named taxes and punishments, as if that naming would straighten backs. The old woman held the steward by both shoulders and forced his face up so everyone could see him. "You gave the orders," she hissed. "You them to bury names. You them to call kin strangers." Her fingers bled into the steward's coat. The steward's face slackened and anger fell away into a thin, frightened look. The mayor's mouth became a small, hard line. "Henrik, it's the cider press on Hollow Lane. We dug there for 2 at night and they brought the bodies. We wrote the names at first. Then we were paid to take them out. I buried my shovel because I couldn't sleep. I burned names the mayor told me to burn." His voice was dry and fast. He pushed out confession like a splinter. The chronicler watched him and felt a new motion inside. Hesitation tightened into pity, then turned into duty. This was why he had followed spade marks and charred ledgers for months. A priest stepped forward and touched the mayor's arm lightly. "We can keep peace," the priest said. His words were soft but aimed to close the wound, not open it. "We will hold a mass and put crosses for the dead. The town needs rest." He spoke of rest as if rest were a commodity the living could purchase with silence. The old woman spat. "Rest for whom?" She demanded. "For those who order names to vanish. My boy has no rest in the ground because no one marked his bones." A man wept openly. The chronicler felt the crowd slip into a new shape. Anger, then exposure, then an urgent hunger for some named justice. The steward tried to pull the priest aside. He hissed quickly, "Take the ledger, father, lock it away. Promise. Let us save the town." The priest's fingers hesitated on the leather. He looked at the chronicler and then at the mayor. "Seal it in the chest." The priest suggested in a voice meant to be compromise. The chronicler's refusal was quiet and sturdy. "No," he said, "I will not accept a sealed silence. I will record statements here now. Names will be read and witnesses will mark them. This ledger must go to an archive beyond the mayor's reach." His voice held the thin steel he'd worn across years of cataloging other people's crimes. The mayor's face flushed, and, for the first time, the mayor moved as if the ledger had scalded his hand. He stepped forward. "You will ruin families, chronicler. You will set scorn upon tradesmen. You don't know the bargains we've had to make to hold this settlement together." His words tried to appeal to consequence rather than morality. He named fines and market closures as if they were heavier than loss of kin. Henrik slammed his fist against the stump of a post and said, "They called it order, then they called it mercy. They burned pages, not people, and they thought the town would sleep. Margot did not sleep under bark. They left her to rot. The mayor did this. The steward did this." His cadence swayed between accusation and despair. The crowd responded with a mix of calls for restraint and shouts for blood. 3 of the mayor's men stepped forward and caught Henrik's arms. The chronicler barked, "Let him speak." He held the ledger open and forced the page between them. The steward's thumb left a smear where fingers had once smoothed away a name. That smear looked like a faint ghost, a letter half formed. An unexpected thing happened then. One of the townsmen, a baker named Thomas, who had not spoken since the chronicler arrived, stepped in front of the steward and put his palm on the ledger. He looked at the chronicler and said simply, "Record me. I saw the ditch being dug. I saw men carry sacks at night. I kept my mouth because I feed mouths here. But I will speak now." A shift occurred in the field. Quiet turned into the audible sound of resolve. The chronicler's suspicion loosened and his hope hardened into method. The chronicler set a scrap of charcoal on a flat stone and signed Thomas's name into the margin with a shaky, sure hand. He for exact days, times, and places. He wrote with emotion that forced clarity from words. "Thomas, tell me precisely when you saw the men and what they carried." His questions were short. Thomas answered in short lines. "I saw them at the cider press 2 nights past the market. About the hour after the bell. Thomas, they had sacks. They loaded them onto a cart. I thought it was grain. They left 2 men to dig. I couldn't sleep after that. I hid my bread and watched. They buried something and put fresh turf over it." The chronicler wrote each detail down. His hand did not tremble when he spelled the name Hollow Lane. His pen left a tiny blot where the ink met the charred margin. The mayor tried another route. He offered money to Henrik, then jobs to Thomas, then promises to rebuild. He used material things as sedatives. The steward hissed that any man who spoke to the chronicler would be branded a traitor. Those threats altered some faces. Others hardened like bread under a press. By the time the priest read the Lord's name, the field had become a tribunal. The chronicler collected testimony with the slow precision of someone who knew how paperwork could survive or condemn. For every name the ledger guarded, someone stepped forward with a detail. The time, the smell, the sound of a cart wheel. The chronicler demanded specificity. He insisted on surnames and dates. He marked crosses where soil had been turned and not returned properly. When the steward slipped away to fetch ropes, the crowd's mood shifted again. Doubt thawed into fear for the steward as men realized the steward's orders had put bodies into shallow graves. The old woman found the courage to name the mayor's steward as the man who had written the first order to erase entries. His name aloud, and the steward's shoulders sagged as if he had been stung. That revelation acted like a small cliff. It halved the field's deferential silence. A laborer cried out, and someone shoved the steward. The steward's blade flashed. It caught the hem of the chronicler's coat, but did not strike his flesh. Henrik tackled the steward, and they rolled in the mud. The ledger flew free for a moment, and a gust of wind fanned its pages. Names showed in quick glimpses, some whole, some burned away. The chronicler lunged and grabbed it again. The more an entry, the one linking the mayor's cousin to a body buried on Hollow Lane, showed clear enough for the crowd to murmur. The mayor's face went from a pale flush to a dry white mask. He tried to command the church bell to be rung as a signal to disperse, but hands would not obey him. The priest hesitated, then let the bell toll once in a slow, heavy stroke that sounded like an accusation in the night. When the mayor stepped forward to speak, an unexpected voice stopped him. The old woman, whose name the chronicler had learned from Thomas as Edna, said, "You will confess." She leaned forward, fingers knotted around a splinter of wood. "You will tell where the orders came from. You will say the names you erased." She did not ask for mercy, she for specification. The mayor searched faces, and then the words came out like a bargain he could not swallow. He named payments and threats. He named a deal with a traveling magistrate who had promised a reduced toll in exchange for silence. He, the steward, had signed documents with his mark. The mayor's sentences were not apologies. They were attempts to explain choices as if explanation could replace the sound of a mother's grief. Thomas, the baker, raised his hand. "The magistrate left a ledger of his own once," he said. "He left a promise to wipe pages for coin. He left a bag of gold. He took names himself and burned some. He hired the steward to do it when he moved on. That claim was a twist none had expected." The corruption reached beyond the mayor to a man who rode courts between towns. The steward's eyes went wide. He had not known the magistrate's ledger stayed behind. With that new piece, the chronicler felt a shift from anger into a colder clarity. The ledger in his hand was now a node in a chain. Erasure was not only local malice, it was part of a wider trade. He closed the book slightly and felt the heat from the embers in the seam. He ordered the crowd to keep distance and asked for sworn statements. He appointed Thomas and Edna as witnesses and set the mayor under guard until a neutral magistrate could be summoned. There was a rapid exchange between the mayor and his steward, 3 short, fierce sentences where the mayor tried to pin blame on the steward and the steward tried to pin it back. "You mean to do it," the steward hissed. "You signed them." "I ordered it," the mayor, "for the good of the town. You named the sums." The back and forth moved like quick knives, and people listened to the sound of reputations being carved. At one point the ledger's pages began to smolder in a puddle of rainwater where a knocked lantern lay. Henrik, hands shaking now from the fight, pushed the book up onto a plank to keep it from drowning in mud. The chronicler shouted precise instructions: keep the plank steady, shield it from flame, keep witnesses near. And then he turned the ledger so that the old woman's son's name showed near a notation that matched a ditch recorded in a mayoral ledger from 5 years before. That cross-reference changed the case from rumor to proof. Silence spread long enough for the priest to clear his throat and ask the chronicler how he intended to transport the ledger safely. The chronicler: "I will lock it in my satchel and deliver it to the county archive myself. I will document every signature and seal on the way. I will read names to an appointed magistrate who has no ties here." He laid out his method with short, exact sentences. The mayor tried to bargain once more. He offered the chronicler a sealed chest in the church, an oath sworn by local men, and a promise of safety for Henrik and Thomas. The chronicler refused each. He refused because he had watched names be erased before, and because he had stood in a cartographer's workroom and seen blades scrape ink from a map margin. The refusal made a new danger. Men who profited from silence would now seek to prevent the ledger from leaving. Night deepened. A crescent moon found a slit through cloud, and the gallows cast a skeletal shadow over the crowd. The steward's men whispered of arresting the chronicler for theft. A few farmers began to gather pitchforks at the suggestion, though not enough to constitute mob action. The chronicler called for calm and for statements to be sworn under the priest's hand. He wrote until his fingers cramped. When the steward lunged to reclaim the ledger in a final gambit, Henrik threw himself between them again. "You will not touch him." Rick directly to the steward. There followed 6 short lines of rapid exchange where Henrik named his fear for friends, the steward named his orders, the mayor named the payment, and the priest named a compromise. Each line was a thrust, each reply cut or parried. The crowd watched the argument as if it were a knife fight made of words. The steward finally slumped and said a single sentence that stunned everyone. "We were told to make the trouble disappear." He had not meant confession. The phrase fell from him like a dropped tool. The mayor's shoulders bowed. The priest stifled a breath. The chronicler felt the last motion within him change. From method to an urgent task to preserve what remained. At dawn the crowd thinned to a circle around the ruined gallows. The chronicler catalogued signatures and pressed a fresh cross into soft earth above the hollow where Thomas had pointed. He wrote down exact words of confession while Edna and Thomas gave their marks. He placed a charcoal rubbing of the charred margin into a small packet and sealed it with wax. He took the ledger, wrapped it in oiled cloth, and placed it in his satchel beside his brass watch. Before he left, he looked at Henrik. The younger man had mud streaked across his face, and a bruise already purpling on his temple. "You should not have risked your neck." The chronicler. Henrik answered in 2 short sentences. "We hid them. I followed orders. I will not forget them again." His voice was rough but steady. The chronicler saw a movement in Henrik that was no longer only fear. There was acceptance and a kind of simple resolve that needed no flourish. He took one last look at the mound and drove a single hand-carved cross into the turf where the earth had been disturbed. That action was small and specific, a marker for bones, an assertion that the dead had once been named. It was not a sermon. It was a fact set into the world. Then he turned and walked to the coach. He had chosen the archive at the county seat because its custodians were distant and impartial. He set the ledger into the seat beside him and felt the bulk of the pages as a weight in the dark. He did not promise vindication. He promised only that the ledger would travel where it could be read and weighed by men who owed the town nothing. As the coach pulled away, the chronicler looked back once. The old woman stooped to the mound and touched the cross with 2 fingers, then cupped her hands together and held them to her mouth. Men repaired the trampled turf. The mayor stood with the priest and the steward under watch. Names would not be undone by the mayor's bargaining now. Enough witnesses had spoken and the ledger's evidence had spoken with them. The field receded and the chronicler counted the paced steps between spire and the gate, planning the route to the archive in his head. He would deliver the ledger, record signatures at each stop, and ensure the magistrate recorded the mayor's confession. He had not expected to shape law that night. He had come only to mark a place erased from maps and memory. He left with a ledger that now contained names, confessions, and the smudge of burned letters that told a wider story. He felt the old suspicion ease into something harder and calmer, not vindication, but the steady conviction to preserve facts. The ledger would travel with witnesses, and witnesses would force record keepers to act. That was his task and his small justice. The coach creaked over ruts, and the gallows receded into the low horizon. He thought of the cartographer's knife, the smell of turpentine in a workroom, the half-burned pages he'd found in the burlap months before, and he closed his eyes for a moment in the motion. On the road he arranged the ledger so the charred margin lay against the cover and wrapped it twice in oiled linen. He placed the brass watch on top and locked the satchel. When the coach halted for a village on the way, he stepped down and signed a witness book at the inn. He recorded who had been present that night, and had the innkeeper mark their names with a red stamp. Each small, procedural action extended the ledger's chain of custody, and the chronicler moved with method rather than rhetoric. At the county seat he presented the ledger to a magistrate who read the charred lines beneath a single lamp and ordered a summons. The magistrate wrote a warrant for the mayor's arrest and demanded that the mayor travel to town to answer charges. The mayor protested, citing market loss and ruin. But the magistrate had seen the ledger and the signatures, and a warrant left no room for argument. 2 days later the chronicler received a formal note. The magistrate would hear testimony in 3 weeks, and had agreed to open the mayoral ledger for comparison. The steward had been jailed pending examination. The county sent an auditor to Hollow Lane to re-examine the disturbed ground and record its findings. The old woman traveled under escort to testify. The final moment of the chapter occurred not in public theatre, but in a small office where the chronicler set the ledger down and closed the file for travel. He had catalogued every signature, listed witnesses, and appended charcoal rubbings and sworn notes. He placed a covering letter to the county archive and signed with his name and the stamp he had been given when recognized as an official recorder. He did not celebrate. He only crossed the final line on his checklist and felt the satisfaction of an item properly finished. He left the ledger in the archive's chest beneath an iron lock and watched the clerk bolt it. The clerk handed him a receipt, heavy with ink and an official seal. The chronicler folded the receipt and slid it into his pocket. He walked out and, before the city gates, he stopped and turned his face toward the road that led back to the village. He had preserved names. He had not restored the dead. He had, however, forced a set of men to answer for their choices. He returned to the field 2 weeks later with a simple note pinned at the cross. The mayor would stand before a magistrate. The old woman read the note aloud and said only one thing. Their names could be forgotten. He could not bury their proof. She patted Thomas's shoulder and then walked away with her head bent, small and relieved in a practical way. The chronicler touched the cross with his gloved fingers and left a small strip of linen beneath it, documentation that a witness had set a marker. He then walked away without looking back a second time. The ledger sat now in an archive chest under lock in a town that owed Hollow Lane nothing by birth, but owed its law to records and signatures. The chronicler had forced the ledger to travel. That was his work and his answer to suspicion. At the road's edge, the chronicler fastened his satchel, checked his brass watch, and set his shoulders to the coming day's tasks. He had catalogued names, pressed confessions into sworn statements, and placed a marker over disturbed earth. He had decided not to burn the book, not to hide it in a church chest, and not to accept the mayor's bargains. He had made choices that would ripple through market stalls and council chambers, and he would answer for those choices by continuing to record and to deliver. He walked into the damp morning with his ledger's receipt folded in his pocket and the smell of oiled linen in his coat. He had not unmade the harm done at Hollow Lane. He had, instead, forced the harm into a document that could be read aloud in halls where men could not simply pay to silence names. He kept that fact close as he walked away from the mound and toward the town center, where new signatures awaited, and where his work would continue with the same steady, unsentimental attention. The field receded behind him, and the cross stood where he had placed it, a fact carved into the turf and witnessed by 2 people who had nothing to gain. He left with the ledger's chain of custody complete, the magistrate's warrant issued, and a village that would now have to answer for its actions. He had forced memory into law. He had not given anyone absolution. He had only ensured that the ledger could not be scraped out of existence again. He moved on step by step into a morning that smelled of damp straw and tar, the brass watch in his pocket ticking out the hours he would use to make sure the ledger's names remained names and not nothing at all.